in our last meeting, I talked to you about Garrett Hardin's seminal paper on the tragedy of the commons. And just to remind you some of the key concepts there, he's talking about common pool resources and the dilemmas that arise when we fail to manage common pool resources in a rational way. So a common pool resource is a resource system regardless of whatever property rights are involved. You can have different property arrangements, he thinks, that govern a common pool resource, but the resource is just available that everybody can sort of get access to unless we put in place systems to prevent them from having that access. So examples are irrigation systems, forests, and fisheries. And he specifies the definition of a common pool resource in more detail when he says that common pool resources include natural and human constructed resources in which the exclusion of beneficiaries through physical or institutional means is costly. So that means it's hard to prevent people from using it. So, how are you going to keep people from going into the forest and chopping down trees? The forest is enormous. It's very difficult. It's very costly to have some kind of policing system that prevents people from doing that. And then the second key feature is that when some users exploit the common pool resource, there's less of it available for other users. So if I go down and into the forest and chop down a bunch of trees, then there's fewer trees for other people who want to use the wood in that forest. Those are the common pool resources. And common pool resource dilemmas, they arise from the fact that people think about their own short-term interests, and in doing so, they exploit the resource to the extent that in the long term, it's not available for anyone, right? So people following their own short-term interests produce outcomes that are not in anyone's long-term interests. And Hardin, about 30 years after he published the original paper, he says, well, I've faced a lot of criticism, and I think that some of the criticism has been fair, but really, if I want to answer that criticism, I just have to make one minor adjustment to what I said about common pool resources. My only mistake was that I should have used the adjective unmanaged. Unmanaged commons describes either socialism or privatism. So I talked about that in the last lecture too. He said there's only two viable options for managing a commons. Either socialism, which is where you have a kind of authoritarian power that makes all the decisions about how the resource is going to be used, or privatism, where you have private ownership and people take their own measures for keeping people off the property. But then there's also law enforcement, right? Like the police that prevent people from exploiting the resource. What Hardin is saying is that, first of all, he's sticking to his guns and he's saying there's only two viable options for managing a common pool resource, either socialism or privatism, that if you have an unmanaged commons, it will necessarily result in the tragedy of the commons. People will overexploit it and the common resource will be depleted or it will be polluted in one of the ways that we described during the last class. So this is the point that I really want to focus in on in today's lecture, because one of Hardin's most important critics is this political scientist named Elinor Ostrom, and she said that Hardin got this wrong. Socialism and privatism are not our only two options. In fact, there's a lot more options beyond those two. So Elinor Ostrom, as I said, her background was in political science, but she won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009. And like Hardin, she's a great figure for a module like this that tries to emphasize interdisciplinarity, because her work also brings together a lot of different disciplines in formulating her hypotheses and indeed in testing them. So she's coming out of political science, but she also has a lot of experience doing field research. She's drawing on the resources of anthropology and ethnographic research. And she's also drawing on game theory, which is an important mathematical model for thinking about how agents interact when they're making decisions, that comes out of economics. So like Hardin, she's also a very interdisciplinary thinker, so she fits really well into this module. And one of the reasons she won the Nobel Prize in economics was because Hardin's work, as I said last week, was extremely influential. And the neoclassical economics models that he drew on, this idea that we're all from an individual point of view, that we're all rational maximizers of our own self-interest, was also very influential. And her work really challenges those ideas in an important way, and so was considered very groundbreaking. So anyways, the main point of conflict between Hardin and Ostrom is this idea that we only have two options for managing a commons. Ostrom says, if you go out and you do field research and you look in the world where people are managing common pool resources, you find that there's way more than two options. Here's an author writing about Ostrom, right? She says, even before Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons was published, Ostrom had witnessed groundwater users near her native Los Angeles hammer out a system for sharing their coveted resource. And that system was neither one of privatism nor one of socialism. It was something different. As a professor at Indiana University, she studied collaborative management systems developed by cattle herders in Switzerland, forest dwellers in Japan, irrigators in the Philippines, and so on. So her research group went around the world studying these different populations, looking at how they managed common pool resources, and then tried to draw conclusions from that research about what sort of principles we could use to effectively manage common pool resources. And so she presented some of her core ideas in a piece in Science, which is also where Hardin published his original paper that was so influential. And she says, look, Hardin has been used by many scholars and policymakers to rationalize central government control of all common pool resources, and to paint a very disempowering, pessimistic vision of the human prospect. So here she's saying people have basically bought into Hardin's dichotomy that our options are either socialism with top-down control or the privatism of free enterprise. And they're using that dichotomy to say, oh, well, really socialism is the best one, and we should have this kind of authoritarian control over common pool resources. Her whole point, again, is going to look out into the world and say, no, there's all these different systems for managing common pool resources, and we need to study them. In fact, for thousands of years, people have self-organized to manage common pool resources, and users often devise long-term sustainable institutions for governing these resources. So one example that she gives in her paper is on the border between Russia, specifically southern Siberia, and northeastern Mongolia. And what they're looking at here in this satellite image is land that's used for grazing. Blue represents the lakes. The red represents the most dense vegetations. And then the green and the gray areas represent areas of moderate vegetation. And then the white area represents sand or just bare earth, where there's basically no vegetation at all. And the point of this satellite image for Ostrom's purposes was to show that, look, the 3/4 of the Russian section is completely degraded. So in Russia, at the time, you had a political system that had absolute authority. It was a socialist system where they had absolute authority over how common resources were used. Government was the final source of authority on that question. And you see 3/4 of that section is degraded. When on the other hand, the Mongolian section in the southern half or the lower half of the image, only 1/10 of it is degraded, right? There's very little there are very few white areas in the southern part. And in that Mongolian section, you didn't have a socialist government in place. What you had was a system of practices that had been developed by the herders themselves to kind of govern the use of that common resource of this grazing land. So hopefully you can see the tension already. Ostrom is saying, look out into the world. Here in the northern part of this image, you have a country that is following one of the models that Hardin says is the only answer to the problem of the tragedy of the commons: top-down government control. And look what happens. You see the grazing land is actually totally degraded. And then you have another section of the map where the grazing land is not very degraded. And these people have not been doing what Hardin said they had to do, right? It wasn't unmanaged. It was managed. It was managed by this sort of long-term system of historical practices that had been built up by the herders themselves. But the point is, it wasn't privatism and it wasn't socialism. It was something else. And that's really the sort of core of Ostrom's work and her research community, was they went out into the world and they said, well, look, there's all kinds of people successfully managing common pool resources without resorting to communism, socialism, or privatism. So her research program was really organized around this idea that we can solve common pool resource problems because As a matter of fact, people around the world are solving these problems all the time. And she says what's important is that we need to appreciate that the solutions involve two elements. There's got to be some kind of system for restricting access to the common pool resource. So Hardin was right about that. So common pool resources are ones to which it's hard to restrict access. So you got to put in some kind of system in place to do that, to restrict access to the common pool resource. But then at the same time, you have to create incentives for users to invest in the resource instead of overexploiting it. But those incentives can take a lot of different forms. And again, people with, around the world in different communities have come up with different types of incentives. However, Ostrom also argued that we can discover design principles that are associated with the kind of institutions that successfully manage common pool resources across generations. She says, part of what we need to do is to go out into the world, look at all the people who have succeeded, the different groups that are successfully managing common pool resources, and see if we can abstract any general principles that they all follow that allow them to be successful in managing common pool resources. And this is what really I want you to be thinking about in your group project. The task of your group project is to manage some common pool resource here on the campus of the University of Essex. And the idea is you're going to take these 8 design principles that I'm going to talk about in a minute. You're going to take these 8 design principles and use them to come up with a management strategy for your common pool resource here at the University of Essex. So Ostrom is really challenging Hardin's assumptions. If you'll recall, Hardin challenged neoclassical economics, right? He challenged this idea of the invisible hand, that selfish choices in a free market benefit the public. So my selfish choices when I go out and buy stuff for myself and my family, that benefits society at large because it puts more money out into the economy, which creates more jobs and allows other people to buy stuff for their families, right? So this is this idea that he challenged. He said that it's not always the case that selfish acts benefit the community because sometimes the resource that's being exploited is finite and we'll run out of it. But there's another neoclassical assumption of economics that he leaves intact, and that's the idea that all individuals are selfish maximizers of their short-term interests. And I talked to you about that in the last lecture. This is an important, very influential idea in large swaths of economic theory, that this is fundamentally, at the end of the day, what we are. We are selfish maximizers who maximize our short-run interests. What that means is that we always make decisions that maximize the satisfaction of our own preferences. And what Ostrom is saying is that this assumption does a good job explaining a lot of behavior in competitive markets in industrial societies. This does seem to be the case, that you can at least use this assumption to make predictions about the way people are going to behave in markets. But it doesn't explain how people manage common pool resource problems when they can communicate, sanction one another, right? Punish each other for their decisions, and also make new rules. That's one of the assumptions that Hardin makes, right? That's an assumption of neoclassical economics that Ostrom challenges. She says, we're not all selfish maximizers of short-run results. Actually, the users of a common pool resource tend to fall into 4 buckets. So on the one hand, you do have these narrowly self-interested individuals who will never cooperate in dilemma situations. These are people that you call free riders. They're going to benefit from the resource, but they're never going to put anything in to replenish the resource. So she admits there are people like this, and there always are going to be people like this. On the other hand, there are people who are unwilling to cooperate in replenishing a common pool resource unless they're assured that they will not be exploited by free riders. So these are people who are not always free riders. They're gonna free ride unless they are confident that other people aren't going to do that, right? So they're only willing to not exploit people if they know that other people aren't going to exploit them. Then you have people who are a little bit more generous than those people, right? These are people who are willing to sort of take the first step. I'm going to initiate cooperation in the hopes that other people will return my trust. So I'm going to participate in the common pool resource in a way that doesn't overly deplete it, in the hope that other people will do the same. so we can keep the common pool resource going. And then finally, right, you probably have some genuine altruists out there, people who always are trying to achieve higher returns for the group overall. And so this is a really important revision to Hardin's model, right? So Hardin's model is based on the idea that, well, we're all just sort of narrowly always optimizing the satisfaction of our own preferences. So we're all sort of narrowly self-interested. And Ostrom is saying, no, actually, human populations are more diverse than that. You do have people who are narrowly self-interested, but then you also have people who are willing to cooperate if they think others will. You have people who are willing to initiate cooperation in order to try to get this reciprocal trust going. And then you have genuine altruists who are kind of like always willing to achieve higher returns for the group, or that's what they want to pursue at all times. And what Ostrom is essentially saying is that to get sort of cooperative liftoff, right? To get everybody cooperating in a way that will preserve a common pool resource, that sort of cooperation will naturally evolve and sustain itself when the initial proportion of free riders is not too high. If you have too many free riders, too many people who are exploiting the commons, then you'll never get cooperation off the ground, because everybody will look out at the commons and be like, well, there's not going to be much left for very long, so I'm just going to exploit it too. You need to have a relatively small proportion of free riders at the beginning to get cooperation off the ground. And then you also have to have interactions that enable those who use reciprocity to gain a reputation for trustworthiness. Not only to get cooperation going, you have to have people who are willing to trust each other. You also have to have a situation where people can gain a reputation for being trustworthy, so that people will be inclined to cooperate with them, and you get these reciprocal relationships of cooperation going. Once you get that going, other people will be willing to cooperate, because they'll see there's a system in place where people trust each other and actually benefit from cooperation.